listeners, and welcome to the Arts Management and Technology Lab podcast. My name is Alyssa, and I am the podcast producer. In continuation of part 1 of this interview, contributor Lauren Cornwell spoke with Betty Siegel, Director of VSA and Accessibility at the Kennedy Center, where they discussed technology, accessibility, and inclusion. We hope you enjoyed the concluding half of this interview.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Cut me off if I'm talking too much. Seriously, there's nothing better than being asked to talk about something you really are excited about.
Well, we are so thrilled to have you here with us. I guess, speaking of the Kennedy Center, maybe you could talk a little bit about specifically how you utilize technology to maybe share certain solutions in the accessibility space with others in the field, and maybe what are some of the organization's goals for accessibility and inclusion initiatives in the future.
You may have to break that down
No
one point
problem.
at a time because I forget when you do 3 at once. So what was the first point there?
So the first point is talking about how you utilize technology or your solutions and share them within the field.
I didn't ask you to define technology for me at the beginning of our conversation. What do you think of as technology?
So I think for our listeners, technology actually can span a wide variety of things. I think we tend to skew digital and sort of lots of VR, AI, but we're open to definitely a multifaceted version of technology. So however the Kennedy Center maybe interprets that as well, we'd love to hear that point of view.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm not sure I can tell you how the Kennedy Center interprets it, but there's some of the technology that I think is that we've seen, and I don't know where it's going to go because I just may not have the vision to push it as far as somebody who's more a native user of technology. I think of myself as a visitor to technology. We've started to see VR trying to be introduced into the cultural space, right? So an example of this was something that I saw at the Smithsonian Institute. They had a traveling exhibit, Japanese artist who actually is a woman who had significant mental health issues, and I'm going to space on her name right now, but she does really cool artwork. She uses a lot of interesting figures and dots, and she does infinity rooms.
Yayoi Kazuma.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
Kazuma.
Natural Factory.
Yeah.
Duh.
The red dots.
Yeah, literally the room right down the river.
She's an amazing artist, but she lived in a mental health hospital almost all her entire life. But the Smithsonian just had an exhibit by her, and they were exhibiting her infinity rooms, which are these spaces that are all made out of mirrors, and you go into the room. You usually physically go into the room on this little walkway through very narrow doors. Sometimes the doors are only about 18 inches wide. And you're on this walkway that's maybe only 18 inches wide. And you've got mirrors, and you have to stay on the walkway. And it's this repeating pattern that she absolutely excels at doing. And the question was, well, what if you're a wheelchair user? How do you experience that art? Because the door's only 18 inches wide. And this is a dilemma for arts administrators, especially museums working with visual arts, is that if that's the art and that's the art experience, we can't go and tell an artist not to, please design the door to be 32 inches wide, and we certainly aren't going to go in and modify a piece of artwork to make the door 32 inches wide so a wheelchair user can go in there. I actually would have the conversation with the artist. Like if the artist were a living artist, I might go to them and say, this is beautiful. We're so excited to have this installation, but I noticed on the specs that your doors are only 22 inches wide. Would you consider doing a 32-inch wide door? Would you allow us to modify it for a 32-inch door so that it's inclusive art, so that everybody in our community, and when I say everybody, I mean everybody, has the opportunity to participate? And some artists, I think museums are reluctant to ask artists to do that stuff. Some artists will say yes. Some may say no, but some will say yes. But in this case, there wasn't going to be a modification of that built piece of art. And so the Smithsonian really experimented with VR. and I got a chance to try the virtual reality tour of an infinity room. What was really cool about it? When you physically went into the infinity room, they timed you. You had like 30 seconds, and it's like walk in, experience, walk out, and you were told to leave. With the VR, I could spend as much time in that room as I wanted to, which is good for everybody, but in particular, it might be of value to people with disabilities. Some people with processing disorders might need more than 30 seconds to really encompass, incorporate, and process the experience. So it could be really good for that. It was really good for someone who couldn't physically get through the door. They could still experience what it felt like. You can open the door and I can kind of peek in. That's not the same experience as the immersion, which was clearly the intent of the artist. And VR allowed me to have that immersion experience without being physically in the room. That technology, I think, was perfect for that exhibit. And they really worked hard to make that work. I don't know how you translate that to a live theater experience. How would VR enhance that experience for us, especially when live theater is live for a reason, right? The experience has a lot to do with sitting next to you and our shoulders are touching and you start to laugh and I catch your laugh and that laugh then kind of radiates throughout the audience. VR won't necessarily replicate that, right? So I'm interested to see how someone with a lot more creativity and vision than I can kind of take that VR technology and leverage it to enhance experiences or to allow people who couldn't otherwise experience it to experience it. Another technology that I think I'm keeping an eye on and that we've played with at the Kennedy Center is telepresence robots. Oh, robots are so sexy, right? Everybody, you say robot, people are like, robots! We did a technology and design exhibit a few years ago where we were looking for technology that supported people with disabilities, but that was also beautifully designed, like artistically designed. So we were looking at some prosthetic devices, like, you're used to this, like we went from peg leg to, that fakey looking leg that never really looked like a leg to now with 3D printing, for example, people are 3D printing their own prosthetics. And sometimes it can be much more financially affordable. So you've got, various different organizations that are actually printing like 3D prosthetic hands and arms for kids who wouldn't otherwise have a chance to have that because the technology is too expensive. But we can 3D print it. They make that open source, which I think is really cool. But that beautiful design, you are also seeing people that, those hands look very functional, although they do make them in cool colors. Like kids are like, oh, mine be hot. But you're also seeing people actually designing limbs to be aesthetically interesting. So it's no longer about hiding that limb, but actually it becomes a form of self-expression and they're very out there with it. And there's some really interesting stuff with 3D printing or just simply looking at a prosthetic piece as not being something you want to hide or ashamed of, or as merely a functional thing, but actually as much an expression as your clothing, or your tattoos. That I think is really cool technology. But back to robots. I don't know how I got there. Back to robots. Oh, design. Beautiful things that are beautifully designed. So we brought in some robots that we thought were interesting technologies that were being leveraged to support people with disabilities, but they were also beautifully designed. So a lot of actually Japanese work with robots is happening right now, and they've designed like this robot called Pepper. Some of the robots they've been designing have been specifically designed to help older adults as we age to live normal lives. Like, what happens when you get to the point where, opening the cap on your medicine is too difficult for you, but Pepper can open the cap on your medicine, right? And how cool, because then you don't need a live person to just be hanging around waiting to open the cap on your medicine. So they're developing these robots to function either in healthcare settings or in community settings where people need a level of support that may be too expensive to provide if it's a live human being. So that stuff is really interesting. And those robots are beautifully designed. So we had this little robot, and I'm again spacing on the name of the little robot, but you can see him if you Google him. He dances. They programmed him to do the dance, the the Korean dance dude. Oh man, I am really got so
Gangnam Style.
Gangnam Style, yes, Gangnam Style dance. So they have this little robot. You can Google them. They have video of this little robot. The thing is you don't realize how little he is. He's only about 18 or 20 inches tall. So he's kind of a small little dude. And he's not so autonomous. It was interesting to get him because he is beautifully designed. He has articulated fingers, and he does this little dance, which you can't help falling in love with him. And he's a robot, so it's so cool. But we had him programmed to dance, and he kept falling over. And he hurt his little foot, and then he would only get to a certain point in the dance, and then we'd just stop because we knew he was going to fall over. But the potential there is what's really cool, right? Especially for people with disabilities who may end up limiting their activities because they don't have the level of support that they need. And maybe a robot could fill in for that in a way that a human being would still be able to do, but might not be as readily available, or financial issues might prohibit it. But we used robots at the Kennedy Center, at telepresence robots. Now, have you heard of those or seen those?
I haven't seen telepresence robots.
All right, so telepresence robot, there's a million different brands out there that are experimenting with telepresence robots, and a lot of museums have been experimenting with them as a different way for people to engage in the space. And we had a gentleman whose name was Henry Evans. He's done a TED Talk, very interesting guy, who had a really unusual disabling condition. And so he went from being fully able to being paralyzed all except for his face and eyes in seconds. For him to get out of the house and to go places is a big production, right? It's time intensive, it's people intensive. He has a wonderful family that really are there for him. He's incredibly lucky. But to fly across the country to see a show at the Kennedy Center would be really a very difficult thing, and maybe even harmful to his health. I don't know. But he wants to experience the Kennedy Center, so he asked us to try out this telepresence robot, which we did. And the cool thing about the telepresence robot is, and I don't want to denigrate the technology, but it's kind of like having an iPad on wheels. The difference, so again, what's exciting about it? Because I could take Henry, I could Skype Henry into my phone, and I could just walk Henry around my building on Skype, and he'd be able to see and hear and everything, right? But I am still controlling what Henry sees and hears and where we're going. Or he has to say, turn left. I'd really like to see what's over there. I thought I saw something over there. The thing about the telepresence robot is the person on the other end. So Henry in California logs into the telepresence robot, and he controls the robot. He decides where to look and where to go and how long to stay there, right? And so he came to visit the Kennedy Center, and it was very cool. Little kids were fascinated. And what I found fascinating about Henry's interaction with these little kids was the kids, they're so amazing. They really were puzzled by one thing, which was Henry real or not? Where was Henry? Because what you see on this telepresence robot is they designed this robot, the telepresence robot that we have is produced, it's called a BEAM, B-E-A-M. Again, not endorsing or anything like that, but it just happens to be the one we have. They deliberately designed it to be the height of a human. So it's actually as tall as I am. I'm 5'2". And so the interface, where the picture is, where we see Henry, because he's got a camera aimed at him and I've got a camera aimed at me, is about the height of my head. So he's talking to me. And the kids would come up and they'd see Henry in there, his face, And they were like, what are you? Where are you in the machine? What they couldn't figure out was, where was Henry? And I just found the way these kids interacted with Henry to be fascinating. We had an exhibit in the hall, and there was one little boy about 2 years old running, toddling about, and he loved Henry. He would run up to Henry, and he would turn around and look over his shoulder like, are you going to chase me? And Henry, who's like this cool dad person, like chased him. Like this, we have this great this telepresence robot chasing this 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old is giggling and running and dodging, and they played hide and seek. It was amazing.
No, that's incredible. I love how much you can use that technology to experience the physical space as well. I guess then I'm also interested in moving from the physical space into more of like the digital space.
Right.
So looking
Wait,
at...
but can I add one thing?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so one problem that we discovered with telepresence robots is they don't have arms or hands.
Oops.
Small problem there.
Can I ask a quick question about them? Are they voice activated or like control? How is Henry making the robot move?
Henry is making the robot move through an interface on his computer. And because Henry himself only has eye control, he's using eye movement to control the robot itself.
Okay.
On his end.
Yeah.
I am sure that it could be voice activated, and when we're doing it, like when we're driving the beam around, you can load the beam stuff on your phone, and we can control it with our fingers. So it's a physical interface. Is that what you're asking? It's very cool. But the problem with a telepresence robot not having hands is that if you're in a building with elevators, we would get to a certain point in the built environment where you're like, okay, we're at the elevator now, and Henry doesn't have any hands. So Henry kind of has to hang around until somebody comes by and pushes the button. Or we actually end up having, when Henry comes to visit us, there's usually a staff person or a volunteer who walks with Henry. But not to tell him where to go or what to do, but to push the button on the elevator or open the doors, which are a little tough if you don't have hands. So now we go to the digital space.
No, yeah, absolutely.
What's really fun is when Henry goes on the elevator, or the beam, or anybody controlling the beam goes on the elevator, because the Wi-Fi in the elevator is not so good. So what happens is you roll onto the elevator, and the elevator door closes, and Henry goes, and it kind of fades to black. And then the elevator doors open, you go, and Henry's back. Sorry.
No, absolutely.
I'm so amused by this. And we didn't think about the fact that not having hands or arms was going to be a problem.
Next iteration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we could go on forever about.
Oh, we could. We thought about taping a little,
honestly.
but we talked about we're so silly. But we're problem solvers, so we're like, what if we taped a stick to the body of the telepresence that just was constantly sticking out like a ruler, and then you could just run into the button. But then when you're on the button, if it's taped on, you can only press level 1, right? We're so weird. But I love my team for thinking about stuff like that. So yes, digital.
Absolutely. So transitioning to the digital space, just like maybe really briefly we can talk about how arts institutions can improve, or even what they should be doing specifically on things like web pages to meet the needs for accessibility and inclusion. So
not to be a downer or anything, but this in 2018, there's a law firm in D.C., Safar Shaw, a wonderful lawyer named Minvu, collects this data on how many lawsuits are being filed under the Americans with Disabilities Act in federal court. And she came up with some very interesting statistics. Something like in 2018, there were 2,000 more lawsuits against entities because of web sites than was the year before. That's a huge increase. So web technology can be very accessible. And I do encourage people to go to WCAG, W-C-A-G, it's the W3C, one of those two combinations of letters. It's a voluntary consortium of organizations who have looked at standards for what makes a website actually accessible. And the standards they produced are called WCAG, W-C-A-G. And they just updated them. So it used to be the best standard was WCAG 2.0 AA, and they had a level AA, and then AAA. Nobody could ever get to AAA, so they sort of settled on AA as being the standard that most people would achieve. They've just updated it, so 2.1, WCAG 2.1 AA that you want to look at. But websites not being accessible is not only a huge liability potential or risk, but they also cut people out. Mm-hmm. If somebody is blind and your website is not accessible to them, they're not going to know what time the show starts, because what do we all do when we're trying to figure out when we're supposed to leave? And we go online and we look it up on somebody's website. But if I can't even get the information off the website, then I don't know what time the show starts. And worse, back it up, if I can't even get on your website, then I don't even know what your shows are or what your exhibits are, mm-hmm. much less what hours you're open to the public. It's a huge barrier, and not just for people who are blind or have low vision, although that's one of the bigger populations that digital technology can definitely cut out. Touch tables, for example, that are coming into museums, another huge barrier. Like, how does someone who can't see that touch table know where to touch? So those can be big exclusionary pieces of technology. Websites also, if they aren't set up to allow for, like if you put a really small button, like you have to land your pointer just precisely on that teeny weeny little button. If you have any type of mobility issues, if you have cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, you know, shaking or anything like that, landing on that teeny weeny little button is impossible. So just small things like make the button bigger, use alt tags on your images, can really change that environment, that information environment for a lot of people.
Awesome. Well, then I guess kind of leaving it off a little more open-ended, but is there any other advice or anything else you would like to discuss for arts managers and arts management in regards to accessibility and technology?
Sure. So one of the things I don't usually talk about, but since we're talking about arts administrators and what role you guys play in this, I'm going to be a little boring. This is not exciting. This is about what role can you play to ensure that your organization or where you're working is accessible. I want to encourage you to do the boring part. Start with your contracts, right? Because you probably aren't designing the website yourself necessarily. You hire somebody to design the website for you, which means there's some sort of an agreement or a contract that you're engaging in, and you cannot presume that your contractor or your independent vendor is going to do the right thing. You have got to look at those contracts and make sure that you're obligating these folks to design your website the right way. And so I would encourage you to look at inserting a paragraph that simply says you will design this website in compliance with the voluntary standards that you can find at this, through WCAG, blah, blah, blah. Because as much as I'd like to believe that everybody wants to do the right thing, people really want to do the expedient thing. And web design, when done well, doesn't take any more time or energy. But if they're not familiar with these standards, then you're asking them to go and become familiar with it, understand how it intersects and interrelates with everything on that site. I do think that what we have an obligation to do is not to engage in contracts or agreements with entities that aren't able to deliver accessibility on our behalf. So that's not as fun and exciting as robots.
No, I really appreciate that. I think it's a great piece of advice that us as arts administrators can really learn from and utilize as we move forward in our careers. So I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. It's been so great speaking to you, and I really think our listeners are going to take away some really fantastic insights. And I think your thoughts about the connectivities between art, accessibility, and technology are, so valid and so right for the times that we live in. And I think it's such an important discussion that we're having as arts managers. So again, I thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed doing this.
Thanks for listening to the Arts Management and Technology Lab podcast series. You can read more on the intersection between the arts and technology at www.amt-lab.org. Or you can listen to more interviews and discussions in our podcast series on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or Stitcher. Thank you for joining us.